Hey everybody, this is Paul from Thinking Christian, and what I want to do in this video is give a response to Latter-day Skeptics' video, Objective Morality is a Religious Scam, where he argues objective morality can't truly be objective and subjective morality is, I guess, fine. I do think the video brought up some good points, and I appreciate that Latter-day Skeptic isn't trying to convince his audience to accept objective morality, because I do think, I agree with him, we agree on the fact that that's something pretty much reserved for people who believe in the supernatural or people who are religious. But I think he makes some mistakes when it comes to epistemology that are worth pointing out, and I don't want people to be misled by some claims about subjective morality, because there's a cost to subjective morality, and I want to talk about why I find subjective morality unconvincing. And by the end of this video, I will have hopefully shown that it is actually subjective morality that is a scam, not objective morality. So first, I'll talk about my epistemic concerns, then 3 issues with subjective morality, which include the lack of moral progress, consensus, and circularity, and lastly, why it is that subjective morality is better described by the word scam. Scam is a very strong word, but I think in this case it actually fits. So the first thing to do we need to talk about is the distinction between subjectivity and objectivity. Now, Latter-day Skeptic defines objectivity as a proposition that does not depend on our subjective thoughts or feelings, whereas subjectivity really depends on our own experience or our personal experience. And I largely agree with this distinction. I think this is probably about as good as you're going to get. When I write about this, I tend to use objectivity as mind independent in a specific way, but regardless, that's neither here nor there. I think that's close enough for the function that we're trying to do here. I think any way of trying to say that there's a difference between these two is just kind of nitpicking. So I like these definitions. We'll use them. Now, he uses the example of purple, and that's an interesting choice. At first, I thought this was a bad example, but I actually think this is a good example that reveals some of the nuance here about subjective versus objective experience. For instance, you and I may agree that something is purple, that something presents as the color purple. And we may be able to verify this by, looking at the electromagnetic spectrum that's radiated from, an object that causes it to appear purple. With that being said, our own experience with the color purple is actually probably subjective. I mean, how do I know that my experience of the color purple is the same as your experience? In fact, there's that famous thought experiment. What if we each of us sees colors differently than the other person? What if my red is your blue? We would have no way of actually knowing about this. Kind of an interesting thing to think about. The other thing that's interesting is consider someone who's colorblind. Are they subjectively unable to distinguish between colors because of their subjective experience? And if so, why? We in some sense want to say that their color receiving qualities or faculties are not functioning properly. So there's an element of proper function, which is interesting. So I think this is why this brings up some of these issues. It's more nuanced, and I like this example. Actually, I kind of want to use this example now going forward to explain some of these nuances. So I'm glad he brought that up. So I think the argument that Latter-day Skeptic wants to make is like this. These are quotes taken from his video. Premise 1 would be, quote, objective morality can only provide a stabilizing effect if it can be proven. Premise 2, God or a supernatural law are unable to be objectively proven. And then this would be what I would consider to be the conclusion. Therefore, we should not believe in objective morality. And notice the similarity here to J.L. Mackie's argument from queerness. This is from his 1977 book, Ethics, Inventing Right or Wrong. He says it like this. Mackie, quote, if there were objective values, they would be things of a very strange sort, utterly different from anything else in the universe, yet we have no philosophically satisfying account either of the existence of such things or of how we could come to know about them. Therefore, we should not believe in objective values, end quote. I like Mackie's argument a lot, argument from queerness. It's definitely very thought-provoking, but I think it's flawed. I obviously disagree with it, but it's flawed in a couple of different ways. And when we state it this way, the first thing I want to do is challenge Premise 1. Objective morality can only provide a stabilizing effect if it can be proven. I think there's an assumption underlying here that only things that can be proven should be believed. So now we need to do is ask, what do we mean by proof? What does it mean for something to be proven? And this sounds very positivist, and I want to bring this up because positivism failed very hard in philosophy. Super hardcore. I was talking to one of my friends. She's a philosophy professor. She's an atheist. And I was like, yeah, is positivism, did it fail? Is it dead? She's like, yeah, completely dead, completely dead. Unfortunately, I don't think other people have realized this. I've realized that philosophy has gone beyond positivism and generally sees it as a failed sort of thing for issues we're going to talk about. Fortunately, some scientists are very positivist, people like Richard Dawkins. I don't think they understand that it failed. Perhaps it's because, as Einstein said, the man of science is a poor philosopher, but it's something to think about. And it failed so bad that basically saying, "Oh, are you a positivist?" That's like an insult. I don't mean it in this way, but that is an insult. So logical positivism is the idea that only things that can be empirically verified or logically proven should be accepted to be true. And my suspicion seems to be correct because Latter-day Skeptic says, quote, "Science is how we objectively prove things," to which this would be my first objection. I would say, no, this just is categorically false. Logic and mathematics are how we objectively prove things. This is how we get analytic proofs. In science, we don't get proofs. We get results that are verified by induction, which provides evidential support, but not necessarily proofs. This is why scientists or science as a field has been wrong in the past. Scientific expertise has made wrong conclusions, and it's generally seen as this iterative process that develops models as opposed to this thing being right or wrong. I mean, most of the scientific theories that we have now, we accept are likely wrong or likely approximations, or they're right under so-and-so condition, but it's not objectively true. And as we do more data, as we do more experiments, these sorts of things, gather more data, we would be able to get closer and closer, hopefully approximating truth closer and closer. Now I want to challenge premise number 2, which is that objective proof is just simply too high of a standard. First thing to note is empirical observations are not objective proofs in any sense. And this goes back to Descartes and some of the other people that, Enlightenment thinkers, even to modern days. There are a lot of things we can't objectively prove, but we tend to believe anyway, right? We can't objectively prove we're not a brain in a vat, we're being coerced by an evil demon, even dreaming. I mean, if you've ever had a dream that really felt real, then you don't really have any, kind of like Inception, you don't really have any guarantee or objective proof that what you are living in right now is not a simulation, it's not the real world. And our empirical faculties make mistakes. So simply an observation being empirical does not necessarily make it an objective proof. But I don't think that necessarily means we're unjustified in believing we exist in the real world. It just means we need some other standard besides objective proof that allows us to trust our empirical faculties. And as I said before, science doesn't objectively prove things to be true anyways. So I think one of the things this encourages us to do is move away from objective proof as a binary classification in favor of levels of belief, pragmatism, these other sorts of things. For instance, in science, rather than saying this theory is proven to be true and that's the end of the story, you say, we have done experiments. This is a very Popperian idea. We have subjected this to falsification, and we can be more confident given the results of experiments that this holds because we have done this more, and by induction, we therefore think it holds in these other circumstances, but more work needs to be done, more research needs to be done. And the fields that are more mature in the sense that they've been trying to be disproved for a lot of time and they've withheld repeated tests for falsification, we can be more confident in holding in general. So once again, moving away from this yes or no type of idea and into evaluating the strengths of our beliefs based on the evidence, which is a very Humean kind of idea, right? A wise man proportions his belief in proportion with the evidence that's there. But there's an even bigger problem here, and this is really the reason positivism failed. If we say it like this: Premise 1, only things that can be proven should be believed. Premise 2, science is how we objectively prove things. So let's just assume for the moment that science is how we objectively prove things. Let's just assume that was true, even though I do have an issue with that too. This would basically say we should only believe results proven from science. And this is, I think, the type of positivist sort of attitude. The reason logical positivism failed is that premise 1 itself is neither a scientific nor a necessary logical truth. So this is not a statement that fits under the verification principle, or it's not the kind of mathematical statement that's an axiom like 2 + 2 = 4 that's just true by logical necessity. As a result, by its own principle, we should reject premise 1, that only things that can be proven should be believed. And this is why positivism is not seen in a very positive light, because it's self-defeating. Now, there are foundationalists in epistemology who argue there are some truths that you just have to take to be true. In other words, they have to be taken a priori. They have to be taken, you could say, on faith or ahead of time to avoid this regress problem of, well, how do you know this? How do you know this? How do you know this? How do you know logic is right? There are some things you just have to be like, okay, we're going to accept these things as foundational, and now we can build our belief structure based on these foundational beliefs. If the positivist is going to accept premise 1 as a foundational belief, they cannot go after the theist for belief in God, somebody who believes in objective morality, anything like that. Why? Because it looks like special pleading. Only I can believe certain claims without proof or without evidence, namely claims about the nature of proof or evidence itself. You don't need to. And it opens up a can of worms for, in order to justify your own epistemology, you have to appeal to some a priori principles. And then you can, of course, argue what those principles are. But it's not enough to just say, oh, you believe things based on faith, I believe things based on evidence. And we'll talk about this more in a second. Notice here when Latter-day Skeptic says, quote, until you can prove this God even exists, it is invalid to claim there is an objective standard. This is a reversal of the burden of proof. If God exists, then there is an objective standard. So if you're going to claim there is not an objective standard, you need to show that God does not exist. It is not invalid to claim otherwise. And as contemporary epistemologists like Alvin Plantinga have argued, you cannot show belief in God is irrational, and therefore belief in objective morality, without first showing it is untrue. And assuming science can do this actually commits a category error, because God exists outside of the natural world in the first place. Latter-day Skeptic says, quote, until objective moralists can objectively prove that objective morality even exists, then it is just a subjective assertion. Now that's a lot of objectives there. But once again, this positivist type of idea. And you could reverse this. You can just take this and use this own epistemology to show that the statement is self-defeating. Under the same logic, you subjectively believe that science produces objective truths. Your own epistemology is subjective. Until you can prove that science produces objective truths, it is invalid to claim that science has any bearing on truth. That's one thing you can say in response. Once again, using this idea of proof to show flaws in epistemology. And this is why I argue that Latter-day Skeptic seems to me to have a flawed epistemology. It forces him to admit his own epistemology is subjective. So let's talk about this, right? When somebody claims, quote, you subjectively believe there is an objective morality, what you can do in response is say, first of all, this is question begging in favor of subjective morality. But if we use this epistemology that we talked about previously on this statement, here's what we get. You subjectively believe that my belief in objective morality itself is subjective by your own epistemic standards, because you have not proven that my belief in objective morality is subjective. So your belief in my subjectivity is itself subjective, and this is why it's self-defeating. There's no objective proof that my belief in objective morality is subjective. Therefore, this statement itself can be dismissed just in using the same epistemology that the subjectivist is using to reject my belief in objective morality. So this is why I think we need a better epistemology, because otherwise we get into this issue. This is an issue. And the issue here is really what counts as evidence and what counts as proof. I'm not meaning to suggest we should believe things without evidence or anything like that, but I would encourage moving away from these very positivist sort of ideas, which failed, and potentially looking at things like coherentism, looking at other epistemologies that aren't inherently problematic like this. We need to be careful about our epistemology. That's all I'm trying to say here. Believing that we maybe need to start, if we're having foundational beliefs, in the reliability of our cognitive faculties. That's perhaps a bedrock belief that you need to have. And any belief system or set of events that sorts of undermines this belief should be at least questioned under the assumptions that it gives. So let's put epistemology to the side and talk about some issues with subjective morality. There are three issues I want to talk about. First issue is that there's no moral progress with subjective morality. So as Latter-day Skeptic and I agree, subjective morality is going to depend on the subject. And as a result, there cannot be moral progress because the subjects of another society are going to have different subjective views than our own subjective views in our own society. And this is why people who try to claim that subjective morality works with cultural relativism needs to realize that cultural relativism implies there cannot be moral progress due to the subjectivity of the individuals or the societies that make up these views come from. So basically what you're left with saying is something like this. The Jewish abolishing slavery is not objectively better than allowing it. It depends on the subjective experience. And you can consider the subjective experience of a slaveholder versus a slave. Well, you only like slavery because it helps you, not the slave. You would argue that the person who holds slaves is subjective, and that's fair. But the slaveholder can say, You just don't like slavery because you don't have slaves. We're equal here. We have epistemic parity. You only don't like rape because you're not a rapist and you're not getting to experience the way I experience it. Once again, there's no superiority between slavery versus non-slavery. It all boils down to personal experience and just emotions. It's emotivism. It's just people claiming this and that. There's no like standard of which to say this society has a better moral code or improved by abolishing this or doing this. And this is one of the reasons I find subjective morality unconvincing, because there seems to be something unsatisfying about this. Neither of these views are superior. If you're a subjective moralist, you cannot claim that one is somehow better or more true than the other. The second issue with subjective morality is that consensus is not an epistemology, and I see this smuggled in a lot when people, and I don't necessarily mean just Latter-day Skeptic, this isn't really me going after him, but a lot of people try to claim, well, we can come up with these views that people generally agree on. The first problem is agreement does not epistemology. The fact that people agree on something, you don't just vote to find truth. You don't say, all right, we're going to go ahead and vote on whether or not the earth is flat or round, and we'll ask 10 scientists, and okay, 9 out of the 10 said yes, therefore it's true, boom. We never reevaluate this belief. We never do anything else. We found it. This is not how truth is found. Truth is found by actually, hopefully thinking about these things and through proof, through logic, through reason, these other sorts of issues. But one interesting thing is that's an interesting parallel is this issue of taste. If the average population, just of the population's preference in ice cream, goes from liking vanilla ice cream to chocolate, we likely wouldn't have a problem. But if consensus shifted from not having slavery to allowing slavery, I think most people would not find this acceptable. So the fact that consensus does change or has changed gives us a reason to be skeptical of consensus being an epistemology. Now, Latter-day Skeptic claims that variation is much smaller than we think, especially when it comes to cultures around the world, specifically human cultures. And I think that's fair. But part of the problem here is that people they're already socialized into a society that does kind of teach them that certain things are right or wrong, that certain states of affairs are better than others, and that these things are more than personal preference. And these are things you have to give up if you believe in subjective morality. Sentiments can change, right? But if these sentiments are arbitrary, just like the issue of taste, then you can't claim consensus forms the basis of the truth of any sort of views. And you have Hume's is-ought distinction too, right? Just because, and Latter-day Skeptic brought this up, so he's familiar with it, right? The existence of consensus itself doesn't give us a reason to follow it. If most people in a society believe a certain thing, this doesn't give you a reason necessarily to believe it or to even follow it yourself. Like, it doesn't matter to me that, let's say 80% of people like chocolate ice cream. I may just prefer vanilla ice cream. So the existence of consensus about what people prefer doesn't give me a reason for changing my own actions or changing my own beliefs. So I think this is where I would want to avoid trying to say, oh, we can just find these common principles that everyone agrees on. First of all, that assumes that they agreed to this outside of the influence of culture and belief in the objectivity of this agreement. But in and of itself, I think even if that was true, that doesn't give us a reason to follow it. And the last thing is just the issue of circularity, right? By claiming something like subjective beliefs can be tyrannical and evil is actually begging the question, because tyrannical and evil are actually, these are claims to objectivity, unless you're just basically saying, well, my subjective belief is that what I define as tyrannical and evil are just something I don't like. So what you're doing is you're just pushing the problem off from saying, subjective beliefs, yes, I agree. Subjective beliefs can be objectively tyrannical and evil. This is what I would say. But that doesn't mean that all such beliefs are equal, unless you are saying our definitions of tyrannical and evil are somehow objective. And you can apply this own epistemology. We can go back here and say, until one demonstrates, somebody could ask, that things like tyranny and evil actually exist or can be objectively proven, we can simply dismiss them as a subjective assertion. But I don't think this is all that satisfying. He says, quote, we can lean on our common humanity to overthrow this sort of tyranny. There are 4 propositions in this claim that I think that need to be defended or potentially even proven, that need to be demonstrated in order for subjective morality to claim that it has the same parity of objective morality, the same level of, the same level of convincing, or to say that it's equally as good. First is that human life has value that ought to be recognized, which I would argue is dubious under atheism/naturalism. So the idea that, we can lean on our common humanity, that humanity has some special place in the world, and that the function of morality that we're trying to basically optimize is human life as opposed to, ant life or anything else. Second issue is that human life has equal value, which is also a dubious statement. This is also a statement that needs to be justified. If somebody's going to claim that not only life has value, but the value of my life is the same as the value of your life kind of thing, that is a statement that needs to be squared up with one's own epistemology. Next thing is that tyranny is a worse state of affairs, which does sound like an objective claim, right? When we say we can lean on our common humanity to overthrow tyranny, it's kind of like saying tyranny is a state of affairs that ought not to be, that we should notice these teleological types of claims, we should try to avoid. So this is something we need to be very careful of. And lastly, the fourth proposition, right, is that the above three are my own subjective opinions on the matter, because I am not claiming that these are objectively true. To do so would mean I would need to somehow prove these claims were true given my epistemology, which is a very, very difficult thing. So if we're going to claim subjective morality is just as good or fine as objective morality, we're going to need to defend these sorts of claims. And I'm going to argue the person who believes in subjective morality has not given us a reason to believe that subjective morality is just as good as objective morality or squares with our own moral beliefs. And then I want to talk about a personal observation here with subjective morality. Subjectivity works really well for people in positions of power, right? People where the status quo is fine. Because if you're happy with the way things are, you're fine just saying the way things are the way things ought to be, or I don't even need to worry about oughts, right? You can just say, quote, you think tyranny is bad, but that's your opinion. I'm happy enough with my current situation. You only think slavery is bad because you don't like it, but there's nothing wrong with it. Well, it's easy for me to say this if I have slaves and if I'm fine with this state of affairs. But if you were a slave, then maybe you're more likely to claim that no, there's something objectively wrong with slavery. My personal experience with being a slave gives me some understanding of the wrongness of slavery than somebody who has never experienced it themselves. That doesn't necessarily mean that the underlying issue is, you could argue that this somehow undermines the objectivity of it, but you could also say, no, you can have firsthand experience or epistemic access to certain truths given your subjective experience. Just in the same way, a scientist who makes a certain claim, they may have subjective personal access to certain machinery, certain equipment that allows them to understand certain things better than somebody else. They get special epistemic access. If this is not the case, then epistemology becomes subjective, as we talked about earlier, including the epistemology one makes to basically say, you only think slavery is bad because you don't like it. You can say it like this. Premise 1, underprivileged people are more likely to argue for the wrongness of slavery than privileged people. Or maybe you could just say slaves are more likely to argue for the wrongness of slavery than non-slaves. Premise 2 is the statement that slavery is not objectively wrong. If you're a moral subjectivist, you would basically have to accept this statement because by definition, you do not accept objectivity of moral claims. And the conclusion is, therefore, privileged people or non-slaves are more likely to be right, but this is not given their access to truth. This is given their subjective experience of being a slave versus not being a slave. So yes, this objection could cut both ways. I'm aware of that. But once again, this is designed to give an undercutting defeater for those who believe in subjective morality by turning the idea on its head and saying the subjectivist is more likely to accept subjective morality because of their own subjective experience with it. Last thing I want to do is talk about why I think subjective morality is a scam. Scam is, of course, a strong word, but let's look at the definition. Scam, being a noun, is a dishonest scheme or a fraud. The reason I think subjective morality is a scam is it involves pretending certain things, like human life or human value, simply exist when under naturalism such things are incompatible with the subjectivist's ontology and epistemology, right? So basically what you can say is the person who believes in subjective morality, whenever they do something that basically you can argue that they're behaving irrationally with their own ontology and epistemology whenever they choose to do something that goes against their belief that morality is subjective. So when they say, hey, that's wrong, you can say, no, you don't believe that's actually wrong. You believe that this is just basically personal experience. You believe this is just personal taste. So you don't get to say this is wrong. Imagine being confronted. Imagine if you're somebody who's a subjective moralist, and someone comes up to you and says, okay, until one can prove that others have some value, I'm not going to respect or treat them equally. And under subjective morality, you would have to admit that this statement, is just their subjective experience. And if you deny it, then that's your subjective emotional experience for not believing it. But the other problem is here, it isn't just you scamming yourself, right? It's not just you behaving irrationally according to some principles you don't actually believe exist. The issue is you actually are forcing this onto other people. And if you admit you have no rational justification for the truth of moral propositions, morality becomes a play in basically power politics and manipulation. So the subjective moralist who tries to change other people's mind about morality or change their behavior is actually wanting other people to pretend that certain values they know they can't justify exist. And as a result, they brush the fact that these things don't exist under the rug. And that's why they're like, I want you to treat other human beings like they have some equal value, but I don't think that the value of humans in some cosmic sense or some objective sense can be rationally justified or proven or ought to be believed. This is why I'm claiming subjective morality is a scam, because you are having to be dishonest, you are having to mislead people to get them to follow a set of principles just to live their life. It's not that I think the people who advocate it have poor intentions, it's that I think they may not recognize the fact that this is what the consequence is. Nielsen, who wrote in his book Ethics Without God, says it like this: it is more reasonable to believe that such elemental things like torture, wife beating, or child molesting to be evil than to believe any skeptical theory that tells us we cannot know or even reasonably believe any of these things to be evil. I firmly believe that this is bedrock and right, and that anyone who does not believe it cannot have probed deeply enough into the grounds of his moral beliefs. Really interesting quote. The reason I say subjective morality is a scam is that it is inherently dishonest and fraudulent. It acknowledges we can't give somebody a reason, a logical or a demonstrative reason to follow our communal axioms, given our own epistemology. And as a result, as Alistair McIntyre says in After Virtue, we are always manipulating them. Others are always means to our own ends. Of course, there's nothing inherently wrong about this, because there's nothing inherently wrong at all, but it involves all of moral discourse involves just manipulation. And this is a problem, because if you want to say manipulation is bad, it's just somebody trying to manipulate, like a boss manipulating their subordinates into having sex with them, you are in the same way using other people as means to your own ends. You are trying to get them to basically follow a set of principles you don't actually believe exist because you realize it makes you feel better about yourself. This is why I think subjective morality is a scam. This is what James Davison Hunter says, right? In power politics, consent, that elusive agreement on the common good, is coerced. The very idea of a coerced consensus presupposes that the mere exercise of force is not enough. So once again, the idea here is it's not just enough to get people to follow these axioms. You actually have to try to convince them. He says, the activities aim not only to frame particular positions as superior to all others, but also to make the reasons for that superiority seem natural. The capacity of a social group or movement to make its particular preferences and practices seem natural is the key to its control. These particularities become standard throughout society while shrouded in a cloak of neutrality. And I think this is what he's talking about. If there's no objective morality, all people are doing when they are convincing other people about subjective morality is trying to make their own personal preferences just seem normal, and it becomes just an exercise in power politics. There's no actual good or bad or any sort of one state of affairs being better than another because these things are incompatible. Rather, it's just power games. So when Latter-day Skeptic says we should use our power to push communal axioms on them, I think he's recognizing this, that it becomes an exercise in power politics. The problem is, if you're a subjective moralist, you can't really admit this because it undermines people's reasons for following them. This is why it's dishonest. This is why it's a scam, because you either admit you can't give somebody a reason to follow them, you just would prefer it if they did and it's your own personal preference and you can't give them a reason, or you have to try to manipulate them. So here are some concluding thoughts. Skeptics who want to try to rescue things like the objective wrongness of slavery or rape are actually stuck between a rock and a hard place. They can argue, based on their epistemology, that God needs to be proven using science to believe it. But if that's the case, right, then doesn't morality or moral claims also need to be proven using science to believe it? And the challenges to this are, of course, G.E. Moore's open question argument, Hume's is-ought distinction. I think it's much easier to argue that God exists just given natural theology and science than to believe that objective morality exists. This is very, very difficult, as Mackie argued. So you have two options, right? You either reject the existence of objective morality for the same reason for rejecting God, or you try to reconcile the existence with an ontology and epistemology that does not accept the existence of God, and do this while avoiding special pleading. Or, of course, you can just basically give up the epistemology that leads you to have to make this claim because it looks so much like special pleading if you're trying to rescue things like the wrongness of slavery, wrongness of rape, these sorts of things that we tend to find morally disgusting. Last thing I want to do is talk about the rock and the hard place for subjective morality. Imagine a person who claims they can get away with stealing something without getting caught. Or we can really up the ante and say, imagine somebody who thinks they can drug and rape someone and get away with it without getting caught. And they basically bring this concern to you. If you're a subjective moralist, you have two options. Option number one is admit you can't give them a good reason for not doing it. They're basically like, hey, I have this desire to do this thing. Should I do it or not? You can basically say, well, my own personal preference is that you wouldn't do it because I don't like it, but that's my personal preference and I don't think manipulation is right, so I'm not going to try to manipulate you into not manipulating somebody else. Or what you can do is try to use coercion and deceit to get them to follow rules while realizing the basis for these rules is arbitrary, and hence why I'm arguing this is a scam. The irony is you are using coercion and deceit to get somebody else from using coercion and deceit, and this is why it looks like special pleading. There's no one level of deceit that's better than another because that supposes some external standard. It's just all power politics. This is why Alistair McIntyre argues that others are always ends when it comes to subjective morality, when it comes to emotivism. To me, this is unacceptable. It's too high of a burden to accept. With that being said, I understand if you're presupposing naturalism, why you would believe in subjective morality. I'm not trying to emotively basically convince people or manipulate them into believing in objective morality. If your epistemology is the thing that leads you to conclude this, and you are logically concluding that morality is subjective, this is the result. And I don't think it's a problem with your conclusion. Personally, I would think it would be a problem with the premise or the epistemology itself. With that being said, once again, I'm not trying to argue from here that just because I don't like it, it's therefore wrong. I'm just instead saying that this is not, and as Nielsen even argued, not something I'm willing to accept. So anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you have some interesting thoughts. You can write them in the comments. And yeah, we'll keep going. We'll keep having fun here. See ya.